So let's talk about how to protect your children from the demons that lurk in the darkness of the Matrix. Most people who come into the world of trust, they naturally have people they love, and they're trying to put the best structures in place financially, spiritually, and just in their life to protect those people. And children are the biggest, most obvious category. While I'm not a parent myself, and I usually like to talk from personal experience, I have spoken with hundreds of trustees at this point who are parents, and I've seen how this trust has affected their whole family's lives, has protected children in a variety of, important, sometimes dark situations. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more in this video about the kind of paperwork needed, the kind of mindset that's needed, when taking care of a child being in your family, and you know, and how this trust interrelates with that in terms of their soul within this reality. So the first thing is when a child is born, right? They, especially if it's in a hospital, you're in a very stressed scenario where parents are tired, exhausted, stressed out. And the first thing that these government agents do is they shove paperwork in your face and they're like, oh, sign all this, and then, it's going to work out. And so that's the first thing. Like, they're shoving this contract in your face and they're presenting it and saying, yeah, it's going to be great. Everyone else does it. You should do it too. So the first thing, in terms of keeping your child out of the clutches of the government, many people think that the best thing is to just not sign, never sign any of those birth certificate, paperwork, social security documents, and then just have your child be a complete ghost. Now, that is one possible way to do it, but it has very obvious disadvantages when it comes to, just having a child grow up and connected to the world in any way. We all need social interactions. We all need to go out in the world and do things to live life. And so when you don't have a social security number, now all of a sudden, how do you get ID? How do you do very, like, things that are easy to most people become a great struggle? It's hard to open up any kind of bank account, manage any kind of money, do anything in a self-sustaining manner unless you have that number. So does having a social security number inherently mean that you're in a horrible situation, and that you have this contract that permanently signs you with the devil? And the answer is no, because plenty of people, they find this path after they're adults, and they obviously have a birth certificate and they have a social security number. And part of stepping off the path of, the matrix and the government and all these dark energies, and stepping onto the path with Jesus Christ and, with the freedom that that provides, part of that is a conscious decision that has to be done by an adult 18 years of age or older. So children, by definition, can't start their own trust. So as a child, when you're born, you basically have to be given one in order to do many public-facing things in the world. But the real question is, do you want their status to stay that way, in the sense that that's their only choice in life, to have this contract given to them by the government, and then they have to use that? And that's really where you as a parent, you can guide them to having an alternative path that's free once they are of age. But when they're not of age, when they're under 18, now they're in your care. So by default, they pretty much fall under one of your trusts. But in terms of, as we protect your child as they go out into the world, when they're in a school, when they're in settings maybe where you're not around, or, just in plenty of different scenarios where you as a parent want to enforce certain boundaries, particularly with other entities that want to interact with your child, that's where you placing a minor that's under the age of 18 as a beneficiary on your private trust, that is where spiritually and really from a practical standpoint as well, that's going to help your child. Because there are certain scenarios where government agents and, certain public agents might want to impose their will on your child and make them vaccinate or make them, or they might just try to steal them, There's plenty of examples of this happening all over the country. And so you as a parent have to enforce your rights. And as a result, because they're in your protection and your custody, you need to enforce their rights. And this trust is the way to do that. You're putting multiple of the strongest protections possible around your child. One being the right to contract. So your child is literally an asset. When they're a beneficiary, they're literally protected under the spiritual side of this trust. And so that's Article 1, Section 10, the right to contract. And there's plenty of robust case law around how the right to contract has protected business owners and people who specifically operate trusts. Now, paired with that, you also have the freedom of religion. And so we have two of the strongest, most historically protected boundaries in the law, and you're placing those in front of your child when they become a beneficiary of your trust. So that's there's simple paper we have. If you join, our community and end up getting the trust at Liberty Aid, we have paperwork where you can set up your trust and then protect your child as a beneficiary. That's like a very straightforward process to do. But circling back to the question, at birth, what should you do? If it's possible to subrogate a social security number with a new trust later on in life, which I've done with my own life, my parents have done that, family members have done that. I've seen hundreds of people do that. So it's clearly possible. And clearly God, it's like we can only be responsible for what we are conscious of in this reality. And so if we're not conscious of any of this information, how can we take action on it? And the answer is we can't. That's why you watch things like this, you go down rabbit holes, you do your research, and then you try to figure out what is the best way for me to act in a conscious manner. And then certain people will arrive at this conclusion, the private common law irrevocable ecclesiastical trust under code 508c1a. And even then, they're under this illusion that there's many ways to do it. But really, there's one, best way that's proven that I've seen work thousands of times. And then there's a lot of other ways where the water is a lot murkier and success a lot more questionable. So, that's just part of this illusion and how it is. It has to be difficult. And so this pathway is a way where you can have a status that is like a slave status using your social security number, where you're forced to do that because that's all you have. We only have our social security number at birth. And then, we can open up LLCs, S Corps, C Corps, but those are all worse in many ways, actually. And it's just interesting because the Matrix makes you think you're being smart because you're like, oh, I'm a business owner now. I got my LLC. But that's the first thing that the IRS starts to target when they start going after people is the, lowly little LLCs on the totem pole. And so all these entities are statutory in nature. They're under government jurisdiction. And so they're just as bad in terms of the idea of being completely free. So in essence, you're not free at all. But this trust has proven to be different, and it, again, uses multiple constitutional protections and has a long track record as far as how the elites, operate and how the government itself operates when it wants to be secret and clandestine. And so we're just doing the same thing that they are, basically. And ultimately, we know that, someone can operate in that way. And changing their status doesn't mean they correct their social in any way. Like, I know there's a lot of information about that, but I don't even really believe that's possible. Correcting the status in the sense of how I've seen hundreds of people do it is you create this new pathway that's clearly a better trust, and then you focus all your economic activity and even any other activity in life, you focus it through that trust. And so now you're not really forced to use your trust given at birth at all, unless it's for certain things that are useful, like identification purposes, having a passport or driver's license. Maybe you use that social security, that original trust for credit, because credit's a liability. And so it's not taxed. It has no way to compromise you. So in certain situations like that, it's great. Yeah, use the straw man. And that's why even when we circle back to what should you do in the case of a newborn child, that is where I was having a conversation with another trustee, Alan Poe, about this because he's actually done this. He actually has a child, and he's married with his wife, and they created their own paperwork for both their marriage, and they created a certificate of live birth for their child. And he was explaining to me his thought process and how he sort of came up with all this, and ultimately, yeah, we've seen in the case of if you are an adult already, you can change that status, and change it in the sense that you create this new trust that subrogates the old, and then you have the choice when to use the old if it's convenient and doesn't compromise you, and when you're handling assets and cash flow and other things that could compromise you in that trust, you use your ecclesiastical trust. But at birth, it is actually advantageous to have a social security number and to get certain paperwork where you can get an ID and you can, do things for a child that they can't do for themselves that social security number allows you to do. And eventually it will allow them to move in a more free manner in the world. Because the point of this whole process that we're doing is to get more freedom, not less. So if being a pariah on the edge of society where we're like a ghost, if that makes us, not able to move, if we can't like travel to another country or drive without being harassed and just, there's a lot of situations where having an ID to present is going to protect us and just make our lives easier. And so part of, what Alan did and part of what I've seen other trustees in that position think through is that even if your child gets a social security number at birth, that's still fine as long as from a spiritual and from a practical perspective, that child is still operating under a trust. And they do that first underage as a beneficiary of one of your trusts because you're responsible for them. And then when they're of age, it's your responsibility as a parent to educate them on what being a trustee means. So ideally, if they're ready and if they're in the same state of consciousness as you, they'll take the same steps as you and they'll follow in those footsteps, create their own trust at 18, manage their own assets. And then that's, how an estate plan can be built where you pass assets and divest them from your trust into theirs or make them co-trustee of one of yours. And then you can transfer assets generationally that way by educating them on the role of what it means to be a trustee. Because why would you want them to be a slave if you've educated yourself and you've taken the steps not to do that? Why would you want your children to be in that disadvantaged position? You probably wouldn't. But getting all this paperwork from the government, does that mean their soul is signed with the government? Well, in a way, it is at first, but then you can take certain actions where you create this new contract on their behalf with Jesus Christ that then subverts and subrogates that old contract. And the way Alan did it, which was really interesting, was, he signed some of the paperwork that they gave, for the birth certificate and for the, Social Security and to get all that process started. He did all that, but before he did any of that, his thinking was, okay, I'm going to sign my child with God first, and then I'm going to do all that paperwork just so it makes their life easier. They can move about the world. God will understand. If he created this, reality like that, if they made this reality in such a way where, my child would need this paperwork to move, then okay, I'll get it for them with the understanding that they're under my protection in terms of my trust and the way that, I as a parent am choosing to move. And so he created a certificate of live birth under his trust and then made his child a beneficiary of a trust that he created specifically for them. Now, that trust doesn't have to be specifically for them. It could be one of yours and it could just be done that way, which is something that he and I were kind of discussing the pros and cons to doing it both ways. But at the end of the day, they're going to act in the world spiritually and in any other capacity. When they're minor, they're gonna follow your lead as a parent. And so you're leading by example. You're operating in a way that's private, where you've educated yourself first and you don't operate as a slave. And then they spiritually and then later on economically are allowed to follow you in that same pathway. And then hopefully when they become an adult, they do the same thing as you. So I hope that sheds a little bit more light. This trust is a very significant, strong boundary that can stop predators and stop government agents and a whole variety of attackers that would try to compromise the life of your child. And there's many other situations where I've seen this work. So if you want to learn more about that, jump in the community, and I look forward to many of those conversations in there. And yeah, for the rest of you, good luck. It's very tough as a parent to protect your child in this life while also giving them the freedom and the opportunity to build themselves up and to kind of make their own name in this world. And that's where this education around the trust is so important, because you're not sending them out into the world, like a lot of parents do, and just having them figure it out all for themselves, or learn, in the public, slave camp system, how to be a slave. Like, do you want that for your child? Probably not, hopefully. So this will give you a pathway to give them something that you didn't have when you were growing up. So I look forward to seeing many of you in the community.